Hey everyone, I'm going to show you some soil samples that will help illustrate some of the soil health principles that I'm trying to implement on our farm. So I mentioned in the first YouTube video that I posted last week that part of what I'm trying to do is implement principles of regenerative agriculture. And the easiest way for me to explain regenerative agriculture without getting too in-depth is that it's kind of like mimicking nature. When you practice regenerative agriculture, you try to implement the 5 principles of soil health. And those 5 principles are to limit mechanical disturbance of your soil, have a living root in the soil as long as possible, diversity in your plants, integration of livestock, and having armor on your soil. So the first soil sample that I'm going to show you came from inside this grove of trees. I was going to film in there, but when I got in there, there was literally like 60 mosquitoes buzzing around. So this grove used to continue across this slope. When my dad was young, he remembers being back here when my grandpa and my great uncle tore out the trees so that they could farm this part of the hillside. But it used to be right like this grove, which has never been disturbed. So this is the soil sample from inside that grove. Now, one of the first things you'll see is I dug quite a few shovelfuls of dirt in there, and you will not get a shovel full of dirt in there without having earthworms. Sorry, it took me a minute to find my hand there. This little piece of soil right here, I probably found 6 earthworms in it. Now, another thing you'll notice is just how dark and rich this soil looks. Look at all the roots, and the soil almost just crumbles in your hand. There is a lot of pore space for water infiltration. We haven't had rain for a month, but this soil is still just nice and damp. I went and grabbed a shovel full of soil from our production land. So here's a side-by-side comparison of those 2 soils. So the soil from the grove is on the left, the soil from our field is on the right, and you can see that's a pretty stark contrast between those 2. And that other soil sample I took is from an area of the field that used to have that grove on it. So 60 years ago, before that grove was removed from this part, it would have looked a lot like that soil sample from the grove. So now I'll go to a barley field and I'll explain a little bit more about some of the things I see when I look at the soil and some of the ways that we're trying to implement some of these regenerative agriculture principles. So what we're in right now is a field that is planted to malt barley. It was yellow mustard last year. You can see over my shoulder some stalks that are still standing from the yellow mustard crop. There is a good layer of residue right on the soil surface. That's one of the principles of soil health, is having armor on the soil. This field was no-tilled. It's the first year it's been in no-till production. It was great planting through the mustard residue. And this barley looks excellent. One of the reasons that is when you begin no-tilling, there's usually a 3 to 5 year period where your soil is kind of transitioning from being so used to being tilled to now you're not tilling the soil. There's kind of a break-in period. The soil microorganisms that are underneath the soil surface, they are consuming the residue from the previous year's crops. And under conventional tillage, our mechanical disturbance of the soil with a disc or a plow or other means of tillage helps to break down that residue. But when you begin no-till, it's just mostly up to those soil organisms to break down that soil residue. And they like a diet in their residue of 24 parts of carbon to each part of nitrogen, each 1 part of nitrogen. Mustard is really close to that ratio. And so what that means is that the soil microorganisms don't have to invest a lot of extra energy breaking down the residue or finding nitrogen from other sources, because the residue is already pretty ideal for them to be able to break it down. That means there's not a lot of your synthetic fertilizers that you apply to your soil. They're not going to be tied up in the microorganisms to break down the residue. Now, wheat and barley is a much different example. So they're about an 80 to 1 carbon to nitrogen ratio. And remember, I said those soil microorganisms want a diet of 24 to 1. And so the microbes are going to look for other sources of nitrogen, and they're going to tie up that nitrogen until they can break down that residue enough that they'll either give some of those nutrients back, they'll die off and decompose, and then it'll be released back into the soil, or they'll just consume enough of the residue that it becomes soil or plant available again. Well, I hope this video was somewhat informative and didn't bore you to death. This is kind of a core reason why we decided to start a YouTube channel and increase our presence on social media. I hope the 5 of you that have watched our videos have been enjoying them. The next one should be a little bit more entertaining for you and not so much scientific and soil nerd.